Can the Chancellor's budget revive Tory fortunes? What does George Galloway's political comeback mean? And the miners' strike 40 years on, have communities recovered? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP and former Minister Heather Wheeler, Labour MP and also a former Minister Angela Eagle, Annabel Denham of the Daily Telegraph and Danny Shrishkandaraja of the New Economics Foundation. Today,
we do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible.
Whatever Mr Hunt announces, it won't make up for 14 years of economic failure under this Conservative government.
Can Jeremy Hunt's budget this week change the political and economic weather? Also today,
I always loved the building, the people in it not quite so much.
George Galloway back in Westminster, but what does his by-election win mean?
It'll be the railway next time. Then it'll be the shipyard workers.
And 40 years on from the miners' strike, how have ex-mining communities fared? So one of the biggest events in the political calendar coming up on Wednesday, yes, it is the budget, where the government sets out its plans for tax and spending. It could be the last big fiscal event before a general election. Let's have a look at a number of the front pages. The Eye. Hunt fuels Tory jitters over election budget light on tax cuts. The Times has this headline, different angle, same subject. Hunt looks for £9 billion to balance his budget. The Mirror takes this warning, the price of Tory tax bribes. And finally, in the Daily Express, can Hunt and Prime Minister pull rabbit out of hat, the traditional phrase for the budget and autumn statements. My opening question to you all is, can the Chancellor change the political weather with this budget, Heather?
Well, the weather's going in the right direction, so he doesn't need to change it.
Oh, really?
Yep, absolutely.
What makes you think it's going in the right direction?
Knocking on doors Saturday morning. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. When's the election? Can we vote for you again? That's what I got on the doorstep.
Angela, can it change the political weather?
Well, I think whatever he does on Wednesday, we'll still be going into a situation where the tax burden is the highest it's been since the Second World War, public services are crumbling and real disposable incomes are at the lowest in the G7. So the cost of living crisis carries on. So no, I don't think he can. The country is in technical recession at the moment, so I'm glad Heather's so pleased with it, but I think I have higher ambitions.
Well, Heather, do you want to respond on the basis of that economic data, which is accurate? Do you want to say again, can he change the political weather?
Fortunately, the voters are deep thinkers. They completely understand how much money needed to be sent on things like furlough, keeping 80% in jobs. It also meant that we've got the concern with Ukraine going on. And again, people are very patriotic. And when bullies invade countries that are only a few thousand miles away from us, they want to protect them. So they understand the government has to spend money wisely.
Annabel, can Jeremy Hunt change the political or economic weather?
I don't think any single step that the Chancellor takes is going to change the political weather. No, there was a pretty devastating Ipsos Mori poll which came out today, which put the Tories at 20%. That's not to say that the Chancellor shouldn't be seeking to put the UK economy back on a lower tax footing. The question now, of course, with much speculation over the weekend, is how he goes about that. And what he must not do is cut taxes for one group by raising them for another in this budget, and that's certainly what the rumours are indicating at the moment. And we'll just amount to a sleight of hand like the one we saw at the autumn statement.
Right, and we will talk about the detail. Broadly speaking, is there anything that the Chancellor could do to really change fortunes for the government and the party?
I think the single biggest thing he needs to do, and what British people want him to do, is come up with a long-term plan to rebuild the British economy, to invest in housing, to invest in a green transition, to invest in skills. And by all accounts, none of that is what we're going to see on Wednesday. We're going to see probably more short-termism to try to win votes now, rather than set Britain up for a just green transition.
And one of the issues that was discussed that might be constraining the Chancellor from spending and investing in the way you've just outlined are what are called the fiscal rules that he himself has set, and also rules that the Labour Party, if they win the next election, want to stick to. He was asked about this on Sunday with Laura Kunsberg yesterday. Let's have a listen to him talking about why those fiscal rules are important.
The reason we have them is to give confidence to the British people and to the world that we are a country that pays back our debt. And if we didn't have them, people would worry that Britain was going to go on an endless borrowing binge, and we're not that sort of country. And in fact, I've taken very difficult decisions as Chancellor to show the world that we are good for the money we borrow. And I wouldn't do anything that undermined that.
Heather Wheeler, is that because he is still reeling or traumatised, maybe, if that's the right word, from what happened when Liz Truss was Prime Minister?
The long-term plan that has been spoken about is very important for this country.
Yeah, no, but answer that question.
Yeah.
Is that why he says, I've got to make sure we're not the sort of country that goes on an endless borrowing binge, and that's why I've taken those difficult decisions to show the world we are good for the money we borrow, and I wouldn't do anything to undermine that. Is he still recovering from what happened with the markets after Liz Truss?
No, he's looking to the future and the 28 billion that Labour want to borrow and putting that firmly on place in the voters' eyes.
Angela? Well, I mean, what we've said is we'll borrow to invest because we need to retool
so apparently
the
that's
country.
Okay.
It's always OK to borrow to invest. It's not OK to borrow to spend it on current spending.
Although you have dropped the £28 billion figure.
But if you have to retool the country because of the green transition, then there's a lot that needs to be invested in so we can grow. The only way out of the doom loop we're in at the moment is actually to invest in future industries and grow the economy. And instead we've got this unedifying dash that the Chancellor seems to be involved in a search for taxes to put up like vapes, non-doms, windfall tax, holiday lets, so that he can pay for personal tax cuts.
Are you against tax cuts? But hang on, Angela, are you against those tax cuts?
But the personal tax cuts he's talking about are actually predicated on fantasy future public spending cuts that are likely to be unaffordable for the whole of the next Parliament. It's fantasy figures.
So you could oppose them. You'll oppose them. You'll oppose.
Many economists say it's fantasy figures.
Right,
Am I in favour of a tax on vapes? Very possibly. Obviously, non-doms are fine, but what is he doing with the revenue? He's wanting to bribe the electorate ahead of the election.
Let's break that down. First of all, if taxes are cut again, if he cuts, let's say, national insurance by another penny, will you oppose that?
I have no idea what the shape of the budget will be. And when we've seen it, we will have a debate and Rachel, our Shadow Chancellor, will explain what our position is. But I can't say ahead of speculation, ahead of the budget, precisely what that will look like or what our response to it will be.
You know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's meant to be my line. I can't say anything because we're not allowed to put out there what we think is going to be in the budget to give a hint on it. Normally, Labour are piling in on stuff like this. So
well, what do you want? Would you be in favour of more tax cuts?
Say what we'll
of course, I'm in favour of tax cuts.
What sort of tax cuts?
Personally, I would go for raising the limits, the thresholds. But I mean, that's
you're going to be disappointed.
Big money. I completely agree with you.
Well, there you are. You want £44 billion of tax cuts, then, do you? How's that going to be paid?
Well, it's just not going to happen this time round, is it? But you asked me what I would like. You didn't say I was going to get it.
But why would you like that if it's going to cost so much? And
because I'm about aspiration, and I think people ought to keep more of their money in their own pockets because they spend it better.
Right. I mean, when it comes to tax cuts, the choice, it seems, we are speculating, but the choice, it seems, is between a cut to income tax or another one to national insurance. With that choice, what would you favour?
Well, clearly, I can't say either, but
you can say what you want.
No, national insurance is all about workers, isn't it? And it's about workers and asking people to do more and earn more and keep more. So there's nothing wrong with that as a principle.
Danny?
Sounds simple, but it's not going to be that simple. I mean, our analysis done by my colleagues at the New Economics Foundation that we've published today, looking at the implications of a 1p cut in national insurance, are very worrying. The richest 20% of households in this country will gain 12 times more than the poorest 20% of households in this country through a 1p cut in national income.
It's about getting people into work.
Well, that's where the bite is going to be the hardest. There'll be working families who will be in receipt of universal credit, for example.
And their income will go up because of this.
Well, it won't go up by nearly as much because it'll be offset by cuts in the universal credit that they'll be receiving. So a cut in national insurance might sound like an attractive option. It's not going. It's going to have a deeply regressive impact. And what the surveys suggest is the last cut in national insurance, only 7% of British people said it made a tangible difference to them.
It literally came in about 3 weeks ago. They don't even know, really. You know, their last pay packet had it in, so it hasn't made that much. It will make an impact over 6 months. People will really notice. 400 quid a year.
I think people who are
that means a lot to people in South Derbyshire.
People who are facing a cost of living crisis that we haven't seen in a generation are very aware of what their household income is likely to be, and I think are very aware of the implications of a cut like this. It'll benefit the lowest 20% of households by about £34 a year. The richest 20% will get £400 odd a year as a tax break.
The richest, that's people on 30,000 a year. That's not a big salary. It's a lovely salary, but it's not a big salary. 30,000 a year is 400, and you're saying to people that they shouldn't get that. That's incredible.
I'm saying that we need to have, if we're going to have tax cuts, let's make them as progressive as possible, so that people who are finding it very difficult to make ends meet at least get the benefit. And of course, there's the other side of the argument, which is about investment. You know,
and we'll come on to investment and perhaps spending on public services. On the issue of tax, I mean, the truth is the overall tax burden continues to go up.
Yes.
Because, as Heather mentioned, she'd like to see the tax threshold, she'd like to see the freeze removed, but that would cost an awful lot of money. But while it's still there, taxes will still go up. Do you agree with Danny, though, that a cut in national insurance will be, it won't help the poorest families?
No, I don't agree, and I'm not sure that we should be opposing a tax cut, which is going to incentivise people to work more and work longer hours, possibly work harder, simply because it's also going to benefit those on slightly higher incomes or even middle incomes. However, when it comes to the position of the Conservative Party, I think that the Chancellor, if he wants to capture the imaginations of the Tory base, is going to need to do more than a 1 or 2p reduction to national insurance or income tax. Well, I would like to see him abolish inheritance tax or possibly have introduced massive changes to stamp duty. These are the sorts of things that are going to be, that the Tory base are really going to respond to, that are going to send a message that the Tories do want to reduce the tax burden because it is set to reach its highest level in 7 decades.
Yeah, but let's return to what Angela raised. When you say reduce the tax burden, it is going up because of those tax thresholds being frozen. But also there are some specific measures that have been suggested that he might actually introduce in order to pay for a reduction in national insurance. Heather, are you in favour of removing tax breaks for people who have holiday let, scrapping the non-dom status that was criticised by the Chancellor that Labour wants to bring in, and a vaping tax? Are you in favour of those tax rises in order to cut national insurance?
I think Sundays before the budget are always the fun day because you could put literally anything out there and absolutely nobody knows apart from Jeremy Hunt and Rishi from their meeting last night.
But on principle, would you be but are you interested in taxes going on certain things in order to give everyone a cut in national insurance?
I do believe that public policy is a lever that any government should pull. So when it comes to health matters, I do believe, look, I come from the town next door to Burton-on-Trent, the big brewing centre of the capital of the world, of the UK. It certainly is. If you come in, we've got a great big sign, don't you? But so we know that a price of a pint of beer is £1.52 tax. And so whether you're lucky enough to get a price of beer for £3.40 or whether you pay more like £7 down in London, that's £1.50 is tax. But it's public policy that we do that.
Yeah, all right. I mean, and on that, you'd be in favour of a vaping tax, wouldn't you? In principle, tax breaks to limit holiday.
I'm an ex-Exchequer secretary, so I'm the sort of person that used to have to look
stop people getting money.
Tax all vices, obviously. Yeah. But the thing is, there has to be balance here, and what we're not talking about is actually the other assumptions that come in meeting the fiscal rules that we've talked about to pay for these upfront bribes to the electorate in tax cuts before the general election, and that is assumptions about future public spending throughout the whole of the next Parliament that have been described as fantasy because they are unachievable. So if you actually ask people at the moment, many of them say that the public realm is so disintegrated, nothing works. They would rather have some investment in public services rather than a quick tax cut to try and bribe them before the election.
Well,
so
Heather?
Budgets are about balance, and nobody's talking about that particular.
Well, we
bit
are
of the
now.
budget.
Well, we are now. Let's just say he decides to pay for what Angela calls a bribe by reducing the increase in public spending. Someone's called it future-proofing austerity, if you like. Perhaps a Labour government will then have to deal with those sorts of spending cuts. Do you sympathise with people who'd like to see any spare money, any headroom, as he calls it, going into public services?
I think that there is time for a serious hard look at the outputs we get from public services. And I think that's where we need to change. I mean, it was a joy working in the Cabinet Office because you saw the machinery of government and you saw what needed to be changed and you saw what needed to be drilled down in. And obviously, Jeremy Hunt has got that now.
I mean, many local authorities are at the end of their funding tether. Many of them are close to bankruptcy because they've been underfunded for so long. They can't do the basics.
So will Labour
Birmingham going bust, completely self-inflicted. Nottingham going bust, completely self-inflicted.
No, I'm not going to go into the details of these, but you've not mentioned any of the Conservative authorities that are in a similar situation. I'm making a much more general point rather than a party political one. We have underfunded our local authorities.
But are you going to fund them? Are you going to fund them if you win the election?
We will have to have a look and see where the economy is if we win the general election.
That doesn't sound like a commitment.
I can't. Well, I mean, all I can say is years of austerity and starvation of funding has created the kind of society where nothing works, sewage in our rivers, the trains don't work, local authorities are falling over.
But Labour hasn't committed to big
pay some attention to that. You can't ignore it forever.
No, well, no, and it may be an issue that you have to deal with if you win the election.
It may well be.
Heather spoke earlier about the principle of allowing people to keep more of what they earn, and that's absolutely something that I would subscribe to. And if you look at government spending, which as a proportion of GDP just continues to tick up and up and up and up, it seems as though the more money that we pour into areas like education or the NHS, the narrower the marginal gains. And I think that politicians need to have a very serious look about government waste, at how efficient the state is at the moment, because we're in a position
at waste, haven't they,
at the
for
moment.
years?
This
Can you make
government
the
have wasted
sort of-
£100 billion.
All right, well, let me
the
get
chief of the National Audit Office at the start of this year suggested that around £10 billion are being wasted by the public sector every year. That is clearly something which needs to be addressed because it's being funded by
PPE contracts is all I have to say to you.
All right, well, I mean, Danny, on spending, I mean, what sort of effect would any sort of reduction in the 1% increase that has been sort of penciled in for public services after 2025 have?
On the fiscal...
Well, no, on public services, if they don't get...
Well, I think it comes back to needing to reinvest in public services after years and years of chronic cuts. And that's what all the polling suggests. The British people want reinvestment in our health services, to build new social homes, to invest in the energy transition to make our energy prices cheaper, but also our energy more secure. All that will require public investment. And, as an economist, it's deeply frustrating that phrases like fiscal rules are being bandied around in a very simplistic way. And, we've heard the analogy being made to household finances. Government has maxed out the credit card. That's nonsense. Government finances are not like household finances. Government, if it's in borrowing to invest in long-term productivity, in increasing the income of this country, in increasing the tax take, that's an eminently sensible thing to do, and markets will judge that favourably.
All right, let's leave it there because we have the budget, of course, on Wednesday. We're all looking forward to it. As I say, it is the big political, one of them, moments of the political calendar, and we'll have a special programme here on Politics Live. Now, on Thursday night, the Rochdale by-election was won resoundingly by George Galloway from the Workers' Party of Britain. We're going to talk to one of his deputy leaders, Peter Ford, in just a moment. Here you can see the announcement announcement being made and George Galloway taking to the podium shortly afterwards to give his victory speech. Now, the Friday evening, the day after, Rishi Sunak took to the steps of Downing Street for the first time in this way and made a speech in which he addressed what he called threats to democracy. Let's have a listen.
Now our democracy itself is a target. Council meetings and local events have been stormed. MPs do not feel safe in their homes. Long-standing parliamentary conventions have been upended because of safety concerns. And it is beyond alarming that last night the Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October the 7th, who glorifies Hezbollah and is endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the BNP.
Now, George Galloway, the MP for Rochdale, was then asked for his reaction to what the Prime Minister had said. And this is what he said.
Do I respect the Prime Minister? I despise the Prime Minister. And guess what? Guess what? Millions and millions and millions of people in this country despise the Prime Minister.
Let's talk to Peter Ford, one of the deputy leaders of the Workers' Party of Britain. Hello to you, Peter. That was a pretty divisive comment from George Galloway that we just heard. I despise the Prime Minister and so do millions of people. Is that the sort of tone we're going to expect from George Galloway in Parliament?
Oh, yes. He won't be. You won't be disappointed. George is going to be a breath of fresh air. There's a new dawn today.
Right.
There's a new opposition.
Why is it a new dawn? I mean, I was talking about the fact that he was actually reinforcing what the Prime Minister had said, being divisive, being personal. We'll come on to the substance of what George Galloway is promising. I mean, is the Workers' Party of Britain, you say, a breath of fresh air, or is it a threat to democracy, as the Prime Minister intimated?
Excuse me, but it was the Prime Minister who got personal first. Out of nowhere, on the day after the resounding victory in Rochdale, he took it on himself to make a personal attack on the newly elected MP, did he not? It wasn't George who began being offensive. George was responding quite rightly to the despicable behaviour of the Prime Minister in reproaching the impertinent electorate of Rochdale for having returned by an astounding, overwhelming majority, an avalanche.
He could have risen above it, of course. He could have risen above it, but as you say, he was equally offensive. Why?
George will be the voice of the common people, which, when was given for the first time a chance to speak about the government's Middle East policy, rejected that policy resoundingly. The other parties in Parliament do not offer any choice. Labour slavishly follow the foreign policy of the government. The people feel that they have no choice. Can't you see? People feel alienated from Westminster. They're not offered a choice on any of the main issues.
Well, let's pick up then on that issue of Gaza and the Middle East, because George Galloway said his win is for the people of Gaza as he accepted the role as MP for Rochdale. How does he advance the cause for the people of Gaza and the Palestinians within Parliament?
Well, George will be a thorn in the side of the government, obviously, and will speak up for an immediate unconditional ceasefire and withdrawal of the Israeli forces, without which there cannot be any lasting peace.
So is he going to find
realism?
Yes, is he going to find common cause with the SNP, who have also been voicing exactly that, an immediate ceasefire? They've talked about and said the Israelis are guilty of collective punishment. Will George Galloway collaborate with the SNP?
George would have voted for the SNP motion, but the situation is evolving. What's required is not just a ceasefire, but an Israeli withdrawal. That is the issue now. going forward. It's
But
clear
that is
Israel
being
not
discussed
going
at
to
the
achieve
moment.
its
But that is being
objectives.
discussed at the moment. What I'm trying to understand is what is it that George Galloway is going to do as a single MP for his party, going to do over and above what, for example, the SNP have done and other parliamentarians for the people of Gaza?
Well, the fact that everybody's talking about George today suggests that his voice has resonance, and it's precisely because it's a lone voice. He is the only real opposition. Labour are a fake opposition on all the key issues. They're in favour of making war in Ukraine. They say nothing about the involvement of British military in Ukraine.
OK.
Terribly important revelation.
Well, Peter, let me put that, because we have a Labour MP here. You have a fake foreign policy, Angela, when it comes particularly to the issue of Gaza, which has caused an enormous amount of heartache and headache within your party.
I don't think anyone sensible would want to allow what's going on now to continue unabated. What we need to do is get to a situation where we can negotiate a sustainable peace and a two-state solution between the Hamas and the Netanyahu government. And many people have been horrified by what's going on in the Middle East, but you can't just wave a magic wand and have it stop. What you have to do is use your influence and your allyship with other people in the world to try and bring an end to the horrors that we've seen. And that is what David Lammy and the Labour Party have been trying to do, and what any decent person watching what's happening in the news with increasing horror is trying to do.
Peter?
Labour are being deceitful. When they say sustainable, what they mean is let Israel crush Palestinian resistance. Does it not?
No, that's not what I meant. What I mean by sustainable is that we don't end up with another attack like this, caused in the way that Hamas did on the 7th of October, when they murdered many thousands of people in cold blood, and the Netanyahu government's response.
Hang on, Peter. I'll come back to you, but hang on, don't talk over each other, because we can't hear.
What you have to have is a sustainable peace settlement that protects Palestinian rights, gives Palestinian statehood, but also recognises the right of Israel to exist.
Heather, was Rishi Sunak, well, he clearly was, talking about George Galloway as a threat to democracy? But he did win by the ballot box.
He did win by the ballot box, and the other parties were absolutely nowhere near. We kept our deposit and came second to an independent, which was interesting.
So why is he saying he's a threat to democracy?
What is a threat to democracy is the groups that have been going round, going into council meetings, disturbing those, breaking them up, going into fundraising events, breaking them up, screaming in children's faces, standing outside people's houses, and generally not behaving how we behave in this country. You behave, you follow the law of order, and fine, there is now one new MP, and if they get more MPs, then that's a political party, and that's how you do it. You do it through the ballot box. But what you don't do is you don't have the thugs going round, going into people's houses, going into people's council chambers, going into people's fundraisers, and even on the streets. I mean, was it Rachel Reeves? Can't remember. She was doorstepped on the streets when she was out canvassing. I mean, that's not how you do democracy in our country, and that is what Rishi was referring to.
What do you make of George Galloway's win in Rochdale? I mean, he's won before. He has only served one term, of course, in the seats that he has won previously. But what do you make of it? How much will change as a result of his win? Annabelle?
Well, I think politically we shouldn't read too much into it. I don't think it's going to be a portent for the next general election. That said, I think that Reform needs to do some soul-searching, and I imagine there's quite a lot of unease among members of the Labour Party in terms of how they respond to this, and increased pressure in terms of their position on ceasefire and so on and so forth. However, I do think that a Rubicon has been crossed in that politicians can no longer downplay extremism in Britain today. They can no longer claim that this is all about a quarrel occurring in a foreign country thousands of miles away. And that's what I think the Prime Minister was trying to speak to. However, if he doesn't match that with robust action, I imagine there will be, the members of the public are not going to feel particularly reassured.
Well, we've already sent or charged 32 people using the Terrorism Act, and if any of those are found to have an alternative passport to a British passport, then part of any punishment that the judge sees fit could be to deport them. So I think the public need to know the action that the government is taking.
Right.
I think we have to remember that demonstrating and expressing your democratic right to protest is a democratic value, and people on demonstrations aren't automatically mobs. We have to be very careful.
So you wouldn't agree with this in The Sun if I just show you Lord Walney?
John Woodcock,
we must stop thugs. Well, let me read you the headline of the story. We must stop thugs threatening democracy and ban MPs working with groups behind Palestine marches. He's the advisor to Rishi Sunak on tackling political violence. Is he right?
Well, I think that in a democracy, MPs have to engage with their constituents and they have to engage with civil society. So I wouldn't make a sweeping statement like that at all. I'll engage with who I want to as an elected member of Parliament. We've got to be very careful. But if people are Islamists, which isn't the same as having the Islamic faith, if they're fundamentalists who are trying to destroy democracy, and it's not only, by the way, Muslims that have that view, there are some fundamentalist religious people from other religions that want to destroy democracy, then we have to be aware of what we're dealing with.
I think there's a wider point here, in a week where we're talking about the future of democracy in this country, which is a concern that we have been chipping away at some of those civic freedoms that Angela has been talking about, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of association, the freedom of expression in this country. If you want an international comparison, Civicus, a global organisation, monitors civic freedoms in 195 countries. Britain, you'd expect to be at the top of the league, is in the middle on a 5-point scale. Britain gets rated as obstructed for civic freedoms in this country. And, if we want to preserve and protect democracy, we need to make sure that people have the ability to express themselves, to assemble peacefully. Now, of course, if there are threats to someone's safety and privacy...
Because people have been demonstrating outside MPs' homes.
We need curbs, but to come down too hard on that has a bigger risk, which is to undermine those fundamental freedoms.
I genuinely don't know who this group are that you're talking about, but so you've got a bunch of people who have been on a march and they're on the tube and they're doing their chanting, and then the tube driver says the same thing from the river to the sea. And now, if you happen to be a Jewish person going about your business and you're trying to get home, and that mob have taken over that tube carriage, how do you think you're going to feel?
But
That's outrageous.
let's remember also that there's lots of hate attacks on black ethnic minority people, including Muslims, going on at the moment.
It's gone up.
I'm from the LGBT community. There's lots of attacks on LGBT people, trans people particularly. We need to create a society where we can have discussions, and democratic discussions, which don't turn into increased hate and hate crime. And I think social media and the way that in which people are wound up, the conspiracism. We've had an ex-Prime Minister, Liz Truss, cavorting around America with Steve Bannon, talking about the deep state doing her over rather than that catastrophic budget. So I think we've got to get back to some truth, and we've got to get back to having a democratic debate in our country that isn't about
threatening. You know what? So, knocking on the door Saturday morning, nobody mentioned Gaza. Not one person.
That wouldn't be the case
Gaza.
in some constituencies.
It would be different. But yeah, well, actually, just before we go and let Peter Ford go, on that, Heather says no one talked about Gaza on the doors that she was knocking on Saturday. What do you say about that? If people are concerned that actually in Rochdale, George Galloway is going to be talking about Gaza but not doing very much for Rochdale?
Well, that's absolute nonsense. I was there in Rochdale throughout the campaign, and George was talking about all manner of local issues, such as the need to reopen the maternity ward. Rochdale is no different from other constituencies. And George was equally vocal about the bread and butter issues, cost of living, the taxation, condition of local services. People were just not paying attention. It is quite untrue the campaign was only about Gaza. But let me tell you, the people of Rochdale care of all complexions, care deeply about that issue.
All right, Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Annabelle, you wanted to say something briefly before we move on.
I wasn't expecting to agree with Peter, but certainly I think that George Galloway has a mix of speaking to those who are pro-Palestine, but also a socialist economic policy around things like scrapping net zero and increasing workers' rights. And that's that combination which I think is presenting
Conservative in Scotland. I don't think you can easily categorise him in that.
Well, Danny, I mean, just one other thing I'd add is I think Danny speaks to a really important point, which is the risk that the government is going to introduce new laws rather than ensuring that the laws we have already are properly enforced in a way that infringes on the civil liberties of the law-abiding majority and still fails to tackle the real issue, the real source of the majority of the threats to MPs and the reason why they are in a position where perhaps they don't feel like they can speak freely or where we have parliamentary debates being shut down.
Let's take a breath, because we're going to go back 40 years briefly from the end of the miners' strike and listen to a report about two former pit communities and how they have recovered since the end of the miners' strike. Jordan Davis has this special report where he looks at Mardy in Rhondda and Grimethorpe in South Yorkshire.
The beginning of the end for coal in Mardy. Miners marching back to work in 1985 after the strike.
It'll be the railway next time. Then it'll be the shipyard workers.
Within 5 years, the last march, the pit was closed for good.
The community is gone, yeah. Shops closing, everything. You have to go up to the valleys to work, you know what I mean?
There's no local jobs. No. Yeah.
And why do you think that is? Why aren't there any jobs here now?
Big businesses will not come up here. No. It's too far because of the cost of their travelling and their lorries. They won't come up here.
Coal was at the heart of everything: livelihoods, the social and sporting scene, community. But it's not forgotten, not in Mardy Primary School. 4 decades after coal was king here, what now for this generation?
If we didn't remember, then no one would appreciate that.
Came from Watstown.
Dawn taught in this school for 45 years, including during the strike.
Lots of things were promised, but not a lot of things came to the valley. And I think that is a condemnation of any government, whether it is Labour, Conservative. It is the lack of foresight. They promise things, but they don't put it in. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not the people that have let the valley down. It is governments that have let the valleys down.
Locals now see Mardy as a place to live, not work. Jobs in the area are in short supply, but pride is plentiful. People still love their town. Pits closing heralded an economic shift. There was money to be made, but not in coal communities. Miners in Grimethorpe in South Yorkshire marching back to work. A similar community to Mardy, it too suffered after its pit closed. But while few of Mardy's jobs returned, in Grimethorpe, once labelled the poorest village in the UK, they did. It attracted £100 million of investment and thousands of jobs, including an online fashion retailer, ASOS.
Everything just imploded. And we even had a discussion, do we need a Grimethorpe? You know, should we just bulldoze the thing and move the residents out and start again somewhere else? Everything disappeared overnight. So it does need investment, and it needs investment over the longer term. So if you are looking to level up, if we're trying to level up Mardy or Grimethorpe or anywhere else, these are 20-year strategies.
Back in Mardy, coal mining is living history. Here jobs have not returned, unlike in other places. But one thing never left. Its mining spirit.
Heather, is levelling up an uneven policy that just hasn't been realised?
I think that piece shows how in England it is working. Certainly in South Derbyshire, when the mines closed, we had 13 mines in South Derbyshire, unemployment 25%. Unemployment now less than 3% in South Derbyshire.
So can I just show you this headline in The Guardian? Less than 20% of levelling up projects completed in England.
I completely agree with that. I've just had 1.1 million, so we've only just started.
Well,
but there are other, Markham Vale is the classic, at Bolsover Way. So that's a huge, I mean, £100 million investment. But the jobs are only starting now because the huge amount of infrastructure changes around the M1, cleaning up the area. Yeah. We went for the National Forest.
Sure. Okay.
So for every £1 of government money, we brought in £27 of private money. That's why it's worked so well.
Why not in a place like Mardy?
It was happened in Wales. Who runs Wales? I forgot. Do tell me.
Oh, well, this is literally pathetic. I mean, I think that the key thing, the miners' strike is a huge scar on the way that our country was run and the way that it was run and the reasons why the mines were closed in the way they were by Mrs Thatcher still has terrible sort of memories for the communities that were destroyed by it.
But it's interesting that Grimethorpe has recovered so much more than Mardy.
But what has happened in some places is that the jobs that have replaced those mining jobs, which used to pay good wages that families could live on, have been far lower paid jobs. They've been jobs that don't offer huge career prospects. The pay is lower. You've in situations like that, transport connections are really important, and they've not been invested in enough. So if you talk to many people in ex-pit villages, they can't get public transport to get from one place to another. It's very difficult for them to afford to get to where the jobs are because public transport isn't there. So there needs to be much better joined up economic development, not leaving it to the market, which is what this government has often done.
Amazing changes in Blythe.
But how do you attract investment in the way we heard in Grimethorpe, by contrast to Mardy?
Well, I think first you start with those fiscal rules and find new resources to be able to make those investments.
You have to have a regional policy, which this government never have had.
I think a key is also about devolving power to raise revenue, but also to make spending choices. I mean, only about 20% of all public spending in England is done at the subnational level. So if we want to let communities own their strategies and find their own plan to thrive.
Well, what about more devolved issues like being able to spend the sorts of money that would be needed to regenerate areas like former mining villages or towns in Wales?
Yes, I agree with Danny there. We have a very centralised country at the moment, and rather than simply handing funds to these areas, why don't we hand power to them as well? I also agree with Angela that there needs to be much more investment in transport links going east-west as well as north-south, and to that end it was a positive development that the Tory government scrapped the northern leg of HS2. However, I don't think we can say that levelling up has been a success. What we have in the UK at the moment is a prosperous southern enclave, and then we have the rest of the country, and it is getting worse. And I'm sure that there are pockets of success where the levelling up agenda has worked, but by and large, successive governments have tried to sprinkle funds over these areas to very limited effect.
You do know how this works, don't you? You draw up a plan, it's signed off by the local MP because the local MP is in favour of it, and they've got that coalition of people around them, and then that plan goes to the government, and the government signs it off and gives it the money, and it goes back to the people.
I mean, firstly, I think
just briefly,
what we should do is actually devolve powers to the regional mayors. We should devolve powers on transport, on skills, on housing, on planning. We need to look at regional development banks. We need to do a range of things like that to ensure that people who live in the regions they love can be in charge of reviving them economically.
Just before we go, we have some news from the Prime Minister's official spokesman talking to journalists, has said the government would support a 6-week humanitarian pause in Gaza if that is what the parties can agree. And he was responding to questions about the American Vice President Kamala Harris, who has today called for an immediate 6-week ceasefire. No doubt that will be discussed later on in the week, but we'll be back tomorrow and also pick up on the House of Lords debating the Rwanda bill this afternoon. From all of us here, bye-bye.